Hello there, everyone. This project, XELASOMA, is natured by two things. Obviously, it's got an aesthetic aspect, and also it attempts to secure a rendering of the human organism through an excavation of its inner life. And in keeping with that focus, I'd like to render for you today an image of human madness. Or, should it be said, I'd like somebody else to. We're going to talk about an individual who speaks directly to the heart and the nature of this project, because he demonstrated in such a brilliant and bizarre way something that only an artist can. He gave us a codified rendering of his psychological state as it was changing inside him. And this man, who went by the name of Wain, also channeled another key aspect of our investigation, one that unites both psyche and art within a shared framework, within a common framework. Namely that culture forms like images and music and narratives are externalizations of our internal dynamics. And were those dynamics to change, as they did for Wain, then it only stands to reason that the external forms will change. Because both the inner and the outer are united under a common pattern. And that completely challenges the mundane perception that culture is somehow disembodied from us, that culture exists somewhere out there in the world, and that we exist merely as intrigued yet alienated spectators of it. But we shouldn't perceive culture like this, because culture is always communicating to us something about what we are. And I think that we've been so overexposed to what we are through art to such a huge degree that we've become blinded to what we are. And it's only occasionally through some incredible circumstance or dramatic exposition that we get shocked out of that complacency about culture and unite under the common conditions that were there all along. We finally come to terms that we and culture share the same life. And another thing that can do this, well, there are a couple of things that can do this. One of them is the primitive, because the primitive strips away all of the gloss of our modern setting that gets in the way of us seeing the primacy of our universal condition. We see ourselves in the primitive in a very raw and a very real way, so that when we return again to Metropolis, we know that on some deep level, we really aren't that different. And another thing that can do that is the psychotic patient. Because the individual under a psychosis, almost in the absolute reverse way to the primitive, they reveal a part of what we are through this exaggerated exhibition of our psychological life. The overspills of the psychotic patient in their extremity and in their uncanniness can sometimes shock us out of that state of habituation. The strangeness of the psychotic can wake us up to the reality of our own strangeness, which is obfuscated beneath the layers of humdrum life and pretenses of being a rational modern individual. So even in the complex sprawl of 21st century life, the primitive and the insane are still our advisors. And with that now being said, let's talk about madness through the lens of art and cats. Wain was an English painter living around the time of the very late 19th century. And he found a novel way of making a living for himself by creating images of cats. That's what he specialized in. However, he depicted the cats in a very novel way because he didn't merely depict them as animals. He depicted them as being like people. So it's quite uncanny, really, talking before about primitives, because this expression of taking animal forms and molding them onto human forms and human behavior is something that the brain's been doing for centuries. We could call it an archaic synthesis, if you will. So he'd take these cats and he'd depict them in human situations, such as singing in a choir like here, or messing about in a cat schoolhouse, and that distinguished him enough, that got people interested enough in his work, that more work started flowing in for him, so much that he was outputting nigh on 1,000 images a year at one time. But Wain, like a lot of artists to this day, wasn't very business savvy, and despite his warm reception with the public, he was often exploited by publishers for his work, and he lived quite a humble existence. Things took a turn for Louis. After he married in his late 20s, his wife became very ill. And we have to remember that this is a time when catching a simple virus was a much bigger deal than it is today, with our access to medicine and whatnot. So becoming ill back then was a really big deal. Louis would try to raise her spirits by drawing pictures of their pet cat, and these pictures eventually made it into a popular book, which was great for them. But it was all to end in tragedy because his wife eventually fell to the infection and Wain was left alone. This would have quite a big impact for anybody, though for Wain, this was the event that made him much more inward-looking and withdrawn. He was still making his cat images and he was chugging along with that, but things weren't the same for Louis after that point. And it became harder for him after the First World War broke out because England experienced a paper shortage, which obviously meant much less work for him. And so not only had his psychological condition taken a blow, but his quality of life had also taken a hit as well. And this combination of a deterioration finally got to Wain, and he was committed to a mental hospital. Even here, though, he was still producing images of these cats, and what I think is interesting in this image that I'll show here is that the cats seem to have taken on more of a malevolent aspect, and they're surrounded by these strands of energy that seem to be emanating off them, almost like auras, if you will. When I look at this picture, I don't merely interpret this as some people have as an experimentation with style. The brain is externalizing its interior effect through the shape of living things. And these threads of light are, to my mind, also emanations of the nervous sensitivity that's fluctuating from the body of Louis Wain. Wain specialized in making images that depicted cats as people, or it might be better to think of it as depicting people as cats. He was incarcerated and so wouldn't have had much contact with the outside world, and also we have to consider that people who experience nervous disturbances often become very inward-looking and almost solipsistic. This is something that I'm actually going to be talking about in a future video very soon. So, under the light of these conditions, it makes more sense to me that he would begin capturing renditions of his own private experience through the design language that he'd harnessed previously to depict cats in novel situations. A threshold had been crossed by Wain, a nervous threshold, and the results of that crossing are now leaking into these images. And so what was previously an exercise in novelty has now become something more. The images have now become the X-rays of his own nervous condition. This is depicted quite dramatically in the series of images that I'm going to show you now. These images represent a graduation into wild abstraction, whilst the artist is simultaneously experiencing their steady descent into the fields of nervous collapse. The cat that we see here in the first image seems harmless enough, quite typical actually from the style of images that he spent his whole adult life presenting. Then we see a subtle development begin to occur. New abstract patterns begin to show themselves in the background, and the temperament of the cat looks far more cautious than the playful things we found in the earlier images. Now something is really starting to happen. Not only is the cat rendered far more starkly in terms of its fur geometry and style, but the animal itself radiates a field of energy beyond its physical structure. It's almost like the boundary definitions between the cat and the abstract subjects that surrounded it have become now interpreted as one and the same life. And now the image collapses. Raw geometry now takes the place of boundary, and the subject is only recognizable as an animal by inferred association. These images show a graduation of this effect. The boundaries continue to collapse in on themselves until only the eyes remain. The nervous fields of light that emanated from the previous cats have now transpired from environmental detail into the very structure, the very architecture of the organism itself, spreading until the creature is completely consumed by the abstraction. I still believe that in the last two images that the brain was still trying to articulate a cat, but due to the perturbation of Wain's physiology, the end result got lost in translation. These images are emblematic of the relationship that I was referring to earlier between man and culture, except here it's being represented at the much more intimate level, between the culture creator and his living imagery. Louis Wain's cats present a vivid representation of the translation of psychic phenomena into form, and this in turn speaks to the gift that artists can yield to us if we see it appropriately. It's the ability of our organism to translate our sensitive experience of life into abstract representation that defines us as a species. We have the ability to cast something that would otherwise be private and hidden into an external rendering that others in our species group can experience and interact with. Images are not disembodied subjects. They are intimately conjoined to our own inner life because they sprang directly from the nature of that life. And when we experience the image, it returns back into the life of the body, where it merges with our nervous architecture and becomes made over again within the anatomy of our mind. We could say that images are fingerprints of the mind. The architecture of the mind encodes itself in representational form, whether we're trying to render that or not. I always used to wonder for years whether or not artists who rendered their images in angular lines were neurologically different from artists who favoured fluidity, and as I get older I'm becoming a lot more convinced that there's some truth in this. So that's the little expose that I wanted to give you on Louis Wain. He's a really interesting figure. It's very interesting in his artwork, and we're going to be talking a lot more about breakdown as we go on into the future and psychosis. And I thought that this was quite a novel and nice little appetizer for that, as it were. So, yeah, I'm going to wrap it up at that. Thank you very much for watching, and as usual, I'll see you again.